you get a student loan, you got to pay it back. But a scholarship, that's just money for going to school. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about timers and then a little bit about some new instructions that we might use a little bit. So for timers, what's the two things that we tell a timer?
The preset.
Reset. What else do we tell it? Start. Start. What does the timer tell us? We got the time. Accumulated time. When it's done. When it's done. Timer time. And timer time. Okay, so those are pretty basic things, but we can do a lot of things with this information that the timer's giving us. So, for example, if the accumulated time is 50 seconds, we could put in a statement that uses a less than command. And let me draw it over here. Here's my light bulb. Here's my less than command. And I'm going to say, I'll call it T1. So timer one accumulated time is less than, I'm just going to put 60 in there. So what's that going to do?
You know, 50 seconds.
Yeah, so when my timer's running, as long as the accumulated time is less than 50, I'm going to get a hot signal. I'm going to turn on a light with it. And I could put in another one that I forget the letters. I'll just say GRT for greater than. And a less than. So here's my red light. I'm going to put two commands in series. I'm going to put a greater than and a less than. So I'm going to use my T1 ACC for both. And here I'm going to see if it's greater than 70 and less than 100. So now when the timer's running, once the time gets, so up to 60, the first light's going to come on, then it's going to go off. And then after 70, the red light's going to come on and it's going to stay on until it hits 100, and it'll go off again. So I can do a lot of different creative stuff with using this bit of information, and I can compare that to something else. And I could even put I could put a counter. And every time the timer runs, I could increase the counter, and I could say if the counter is less than 5, turn on a light. So I could do some math with that. So that's one thing we can do with timers. We can use this accumulated value, and we can make decisions based on what that accumulated value is. If I use another kind of timer that we haven't really used much yet, which is a retentive timer. So retentive timer, it just keeps its value. So when you stop, it stops at whatever number it's at. Then when you start it, it keeps going up. So you could use a retentive timer on a water pump And this. So I could use a greater than command, and maybe I'd put, I don't know, 600. So when my cumulative time gets above 600 minutes, then I get a signal that tells me that I have to go and, I don't know, grease the pump or do something to the pump. So I can use that kind of information. Anyway, that's real handy. And look who's got the bed. Another thing I can do is I can take advantage. Timers have kind of quirks that you have to get used to. Like one quirk is that when you push the start button to start a timer, if you don't hold that start button going, it's going to stop and reset. So it's just the way that they design them. Another thing about timers is when they finish, the done bit will go hot, and then as soon as the timer resets, the done bit goes cold. So the done bit in some ways is not very useful because it's not like you can turn a light on because the light's not going to stay on. It will just do a flash. So that's not very useful. But what is useful is the done bit is almost an instantaneous signal. You get like one signal for one scan of the routine, and then it goes away. And that can be useful for, can't think of an example. But sometimes you want to have just a single quick signal to start something or turn something on. And you can't keep your finger on the button. So for example, with an older car, what happens if you turn the key to the start position and keep it there? It's going to chew up the gears on your starter motor, right? Or if the car is already running, you turn the key to start, it's going to wreck your starter. Newer cars don't have that problem because they have more electronics control. But the cool thing about the done bit is you can get a one-time signal with it. And because you can do that, you can avoid learning a bunch of other commands. So if you have the textbook, I think it's chapter 11, there's a bunch of commands called a ONS, OSR, and OSF. And those are one-shot commands. So one shot rising, one shot falling. And what does rising and falling mean? We use that terminology before? I don't think so. So rising and falling, it's just a shortcut way of saying when you turn something on, when you turn something off. So when you push the button, as soon as you push it, that's a rising signal because it goes from cold to hot. And then when you take your finger off the button, that's a falling signal because it goes from hot to cold. So it's kind of, we got three commands here. One shot rising, one shot falling. They're all based on the concept that you need an instant signal that just it goes hot one time, then goes away. So I don't like learning new commands and extra commands that I'm never going to use. So what I do, I don't ever use these guys. If I need an instantaneous signal, I'm just going to put in a timer and I'm going to put in a preset of like 0.01. So I've got a timer that runs for 1/10 of a second, which is almost no time at all. And when that timer finishes, my done bit is going to go hot for one cycle of the scan, and then it's going to go cold. So my done bit gives me a one-shot signal. Instead of worrying about a whole different command to learn how to use it, if I just want an instant signal, I just put in a really short timer and I use the done bit to get the signal out of it. Does that sound like a good idea? Another use for a timer, and you probably get the idea that I like timers. Sometimes if you work in a factory or manufacturing environment, sometimes they've got really old equipment, and big old pumps. And sometimes old motors don't start very well. If you don't hold the start button down for like a second, then sometimes the motor it'll try starting, but it just won't start. It needs a long, strong signal to get it started. So you could put a sign up on the control panel to tell the operators that when they start the pump, they have to hold their finger on the button for 2 seconds to make sure it starts. And is that reliable? Probably not, right? Because people are lazy. So here's my ladder. Here's my start button, and here's my pump. And I found out with this old pump that you got to hold your finger on that start button for 2 seconds to get the pump to run, or it just won't start. And because the operators, you can't rely on them, I want to build something in that makes sure that I don't have to rely on them. So what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to put in a timer. And I'm going to put a preset of 3 seconds. And then down here on the next rung, I'm going to use that timer timing bit to start my pump. So now I don't care how long the operator pushes that button. As soon as they push the button, it's going to start the timer because the timers they're very reliable. So I know the timer is going to start, and then this timer is going to run for 3 seconds. And while it's running for 3 seconds, I'm going to get a hot signal coming out to start my pump. And that way I know that I don't have to rely on the operator to hold their finger on the button and start the pump because my timer is going to do it for me. Yeah.
We have to address the timer, like address.
Yeah, I'm kind of taking shortcuts, but you have to do a proper address on the timer to make it work. So some neat stuff you can do with timers. And what I find is it's better to learn a few commands and learn how they work very well, rather than try to learn a bunch of different commands. Okay, enough about timers. Let's talk about counters. You haven't done any more counters yet, have you? So counters start with a C. And I think it's C5. I have to look in the software. Anyone have it open?
Yeah, that's right.
C5? So counter is a C5 colon 0 slash 5, something like that. I'm not sure, but the address doesn't matter for now. Counters are very similar to timers. So with a counter, we have to tell it three things now. And a counter will tell us two things. So what's the counter going to tell us?
How much?
Yeah, the accumulated value.
So a counter has an ACC.
What else would the counter tell us? Does it have like a timer timing, counter counting? Think so?
Wouldn't that be the later one?
Well, we've got the value that accumulated, like it's counted up to 5.
Oh, okay. So yeah, it would be that. Because if you're giving in how much, that's pretty much works like a timer then.
Similar, close. Huh?
Counts up, counts down.
That's two things that we tell it. So we've got up, down. So timer, we only tell it to turn on because it can only go one direction, but a counter can go both directions, go up and down. How about a preset? Would that make sense?
How much you want to.
Yeah, so if I'm managing a parking lot, I know I have 10 spaces in my parking lot, I'd want a counter to tell me when the place is full, right? So I've got a preset. So what would this other thing be that the counter tells us? It's similar to a timer. Counters, when they count, they just count and they're finished. So it's not like a continuous thing.
Reset. And then counts again.
There's a reset, but we're not gonna worry about reset yet. How about a done bit? So they're very similar to timers, but they've got little different quirks than timers have. First of all, we tell a counter either to go up or down. With a timer, we only tell it to, I should have left my timer on here. Put a timer back on. So timers, we got a pre, and we got start. And timers tell us an ACC. They tell us a done. And they tell us a timer timing. So they both got accumulated values. They both got done bits. They both have presets. So those parts are all the same with timers and counters. The first difference is with timers, we only tell it to start. And with counters, we have to tell it which direction to go, either up or down. So that's the first difference. Another difference is with timers, we have to keep the signal to keep it going. So when you push the start button, you got to either keep your finger on the button or you got to do a seal-in logic or something to keep your timer going. But with counters, you don't have to keep them going because they get one signal and they go up or they go down, whichever way you're telling it to go. So that's a difference. Over here, we use timer timing a lot, but there's no counter counting. So that's, we don't have that equivalent. So that's different. Another big one is when a timer is finished, the done bit goes hot for one time, and then usually it resets and then the hot signal goes away. With counters, the done bit goes hot and it stays hot. So it's a little bit opposite that way. And I guess the last difference is with a timer, if you're not keeping it going, it's going to go off and it's going to reset. With a counter, it's not going to reset automatically because it doesn't have to be kept going. So you have to tell a counter that you want it to reset. So is that confusing? Everything to do with PLC programming, the textbooks and the software, they always put timers and counters together because they have some similarities, but they're actually pretty different, aren't they? So this timer won't stay running. The counter doesn't have to stay running because it's not a continuous thing. They both have a preset. Timer has a start, counter has an up and down. Timers reset all by themselves. Counters don't. Counters, you have to actually tell it to reset or it won't reset. The done bit doesn't stay hot, the done bit stays hot. And we're gonna get into,
You said that timers reset on their own, so you can turn that off, right? By doing what?
so when you use a timer, you have to somehow seal in the whatever's making it run. So you seal in logic is the most common. But with a counter, you don't seal it in. Let me draw a little bit of these guys. So when I have a timer and I have my start button, I need to do something to seal that in. And often I use the timer timing just so it keeps itself going so the timer runs. With a counter, I have to tell it either up or I have to tell it down. But I don't have to seal those signals in because as soon as I get that signal, I get the indication that that's counted. One thing that's very common is we use timers and counters together. So here's my timer, and my timer has a done bit. I can use my done bit as a count up on my counter, and I can count how many times the timer has run. So if I have a water pump, and I know the pump has to be serviced every 800 cycles, then every time the water pump starts, and maybe I'm using a timer to start my water pump. Every time that done bit from that timer goes hot, I increase my counter. And if my counter has a preset of 900, then after 900 cycles, I'm going to get a signal from the counter saying that I've reached my preset. So they're very handy to use them together. So any questions about that? Okay, well, that's probably enough for today about timers and counters. They're very similar, but they're pretty different too.